Thank you very much for coming today to discuss the Syrian refugee problem as it applies and as it affects to Lebanon. We hear a lot about the Syrian refugee problem, but I don't think that America is very knowledgeable on what is going on in Lebanon and the impact of the refugee crisis on the communities in that country. And that's where we would like to focus. And in that regard, let me just say that I'd like to thank Jim Zogby, who I'm going to introduce in a second, and Maya Berry, who's here, for AAI for putting this event together and asking Paul and I to participate. My name is Gabriel. I am the president of the American Task Force for Lebanon. I was the former U.S. ambassador to Morocco, and I served in a voluntary capacity with my two colleagues, George Cody, who's here, the executive director, and Deep Kiwi from the American Task Force for Lebanon. The uprising, the Syrian uprising, occurred 4 years ago, March 15th, 4 years ago this month. We have a chart here that hopefully most of you can see. There's not much that you have to read. The red tells it all. And in 2011, there were 25,000 refugees that came into Lebanon. You can see that there. The next year, 12, there were 480,000 refugees that came into Lebanon. The third year, 1.1 million. All that's left in white are really places that are not very livable, mountainous regions. So you can see that that impact has been tremendous on the country. Today, there are 1.2 million refugees that are registered, with another 300,000 Syrians who are unofficial refugees or otherwise living in Lebanon, which amounts to about 30% of the country. Think about that. That would be like percentage-wise in the United States of having all of Canada come south. The whole entire population of Canada comes south, plus half the population of Mexico. We have problems discussing 10 or 20,000 refugees at a time. Can you imagine if we had that kind of impact in our country? The host communities are really affected with water, sanitation, education, health, housing, subsidized electricity, and food supplies. In addition, there are about just under 100,000 Syrian children, refugee children, in schools in Lebanon. But there's another about 400,000 that are not in school. So we're starting to deal with what a lot of people are calling the lost generation of young people. And 47% of the Syrians in Lebanon are economically active, meaning they're competing for jobs with Lebanon. So you can see the economic impact that occurs, as well as the impact on these communities and what it might portend. Add to it that you have another problem, and that is you've got Daesh knocking on the door, and as well as the Nusra Front, with other terrorist kinds of problems. The Lebanese armed forces are doing a very good job in terms of protecting the country, but Lebanon is literally on the brink of its own survival. And something that Jim Zogby talked to me about some time ago, and that is that our two organizations feel very strongly that we've got to start to publicize this problem in America with policymakers here so that people can understand what we're dealing with. As I said, we have two distinguished people with us today, Dr. Zogby and Dr. Salem. Dr. Salem is Vice President for Policy and Research at the Middle East Institute, where he focuses on democratic transition and conflict with a regional emphasis on the countries of the Levant and Egypt. He writes regularly in the Arab and Western press and has been published throughout the world. Dr. Salem is also author of numerous books, most recently Broken Borders, The Causes and Consequences of the Arab Uprising, and Iraq's Tangled Foreign Relations. Dr. Salem was also the founding director of Carnegie's Middle East Center in Beirut. So we're very lucky to have Paul with us today. And of course, you all have heard of, if not know, Dr. James Zogby, the co-founder of the American Arab Institute, which he founded in 1985 and continues to serve as its president. Jim is also on the executive committee of the Democratic National Committee and was appointed just last year by President Obama to the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom in 2013, 2 years ago, excuse me. Jim writes a weekly publication that is published in 16 countries and is a host on many different television shows. And he's also an author. You might have seen him last night on Aaron Burnett, which is, I think, your most recent TV appearance, unless you did something this morning. So Dr. Zogby is a well-known face and a great advocate for Arab American issues and issues involving the relationship between the United States and the Middle East. So let me begin by asking Jim to say a few words.
Thanks, Ed. I might have done an appearance this morning because they called me after I finished the Aaron Burnett show and said they wanted me on the early morning CNN show at 6:40. But I don't do sixes. Anymore. Folks in my office will tell you I don't do sevens or eights or even nines. It happens when you get old. But thanks, Ed, for being with us as part of the task force and working with us as you have over the years on what is a very critical position right now, and that is what is happening to Lebanon. Before I go any further, I just want to recognize Maria Saab, who's here up front. Maria is the principal author of this report, and I want to make sure that you take a copy of it, and if you take a copy for your member as well, that would be great. We did the report because I call Lebanon the Forgotten Front. It is every bit as much engaged in this battle against the Islamic State and extremism in the Middle East as is the rest of the coalition that is fighting in Syria and fighting in Lebanon and fighting in Iraq. But because Lebanon participates in the coalition, came here to the initial founding meeting, and has worked collectively on intelligence and other processes, they do not have coalition forces fighting in Lebanon. Lebanon is carrying the fight out by itself. That is their preferred approach, and they're capable of doing it with more support. But it's happening quietly. It's happening without people paying attention. And we felt that it was important that people start to pay attention because while Lebanon has had a very difficult last several decades, a civil war that lasted 15 years, in which basically everybody in the neighborhood saw Lebanon as a playground to carry out their own intramural fights. They did it on Lebanese territory. And then for several years after that, years before it and years after it, Lebanon was occupied in the south by Israel and by Syria for many years after the end of the Civil War. And despite all of that, there's a resilience to the country. And there are internal problems, no doubt. One can't find a country where there aren't internal problems. I mean, we as Americans know about red state, blue state, and everything in between, and the problems that we have here. Lebanon has its internal problems. But when we poll, there is a shared identity, there's a shared commitment to common goals and a vision for the future, and a sense that Lebanese want their country whole and want their country at peace, and they want it to prosper. And so, look, They have had to deal in the last 3 years, you see the picture here, with about 30% of their population now being refugees. This on top of Palestinian refugees and Iraqi refugees who flooded the country in years before, making it almost 1 out of every 3 people are a refugee. And yet, given that, the country has survived, that it hasn't gone over the brink, it hasn't reignited a civil war. There have been bombings, by one side against the other, and vice versa. And there have been other rather provocative circumstances that have developed. The village of Arsal, for example, on the Syrian border, was 35,000, is now 100,000, triple the population because of refugees. And ISIS has made a stab at taking control of the community. They kidnapped Lebanese soldiers. They were going to make a trade. We'll give you the soldiers, you give us Arsal. The Lebanese said no, and the standoff has continued. And yet, even with that, the country's maintained its resilience and its commitment not to go over the edge into civil war. I had mentioned some of the hardships that the country's had to endure. There are today well over 1 million Lebanese living below the poverty line. The number's increased by 300,000 since the Syrian refugee crisis. Lebanese are being priced out of the housing market because Syrians are getting vouchers from the United Nations, and the Lebanese get none. Syrians are pricing Lebanese out of the job market because they're willing to work for less and need to work for less. This should not ever be a Lebanese versus Syrian conflict within the borders of Lebanon, but one can easily understand where that might occur, especially in some Lebanese villages where people are sort of at the tipping point. And they see themselves priced out of the market, they see themselves unemployment. Youth unemployment in Lebanon has doubled since this crisis began. And all of this is a recipe for explosion and disaster. And because not only Lebanon doesn't need it, but the region, I don't think, could absorb it. With Iraq being where it is and Syria being where it is, another country falling apart would not be in anyone's interest. And in particular, it wouldn't be an interest of the United States of America. Lebanon, for all of its difficulties, has remained a partner. And the Lebanese military has been a very close partner with the United States, and it's been supported, but not to the degree that it needs to be supported by the Pentagon and by Congress in the assistance that it receives. If Lebanon were to fall apart, the regional implications, I think, would be quite devastating. It is a country that has maintained its stability under these incredibly difficult circumstances, and it needs to be supported. And so our interest in putting the book together was so that you would get the details. It's got a narrative story that it tells up front, and then enumerates the degree of the problem of the number of children out of school, the number of villages that are being negatively impacted, the number of unemployed, the number of the amount that Lebanon has lost in its GNP as a result of this crisis next door. What's happened to tourism, which is one of the major issues, major resources in the country. What's happened to the banking sector, and how Lebanon's capacity is being stretched to the limit and even beyond, with its inability to provide everything from electricity and water and sanitation pickup to this explosion of population. I mean, Ed mentioned the numbers, but imagine, I mean, we get heartache over 11 million people undocumented. What if it were over 100 million? And flooding into the country within a 2-year or 3-year period. The shock to the system is so great. The country's having difficulty bearing up under it. And that's why it needs attention and it needs support. And so we believe America can do more and ought to do more. The foundation of our relationship, Lebanon and the United States, has always been based on on the importance of the Lebanese American community. One can't think of diplomacy without thinking of George Mitchell or thinking of Philip Habib or thinking of people who made enormous contributions to our country in so many ways. And yet that's been the basis of the close ties between our countries. And it needs somehow today to be remembered, and the closeness needs to be rewarded with attention being paid to the real problems that are being visited upon Lebanon by this war next door that Lebanon neither started, but is the major recipient of the burden of today. And I'll turn it over to Paul.
Let me just say one thing. The United States is the largest donor for refugee aid in Lebanon. Having said that, at the last donors conference, I don't know what the commitment was, but only 52% of the commitments made have been delivered. There's going to be another donor conference at the end of the month, and they're going to look for $8.4 billion. I'm sure the United States will be principal among those who make commitments, but now's the time for all of us to get involved in that effort in the next few weeks and let policymakers know how important this commitment by the U.S.
Only one caveat to that, and that is that the donor commitments for Syrian refugees have not been met, but what has not been addressed is the capacity of Lebanon on their side to absorb the refugees and to care for their own people in the process. And so,
very good point, and that's something I think that Paul will address in terms of the pressure on Lebanon. Dr. Salem.
Well, thank you. First, I want to commend the Arab American Institute for putting together this report and congratulate Maria on a really excellent report. Every page, every paragraph has excellent information, excellent analysis, excellent recommendations. Really one of the best reports I've seen. So congratulations to the Institute, Maria, and Maya. Really great piece of work, and I really don't have anything to add per se to the report. I urge you to read it. It is really, really very good, and I thank Ed and the task force for being part of this this event. I'll offer a few reflections and a few comments. I'm always reminded of what Boris Yeltsin said when Russia was going through a difficult period, and they asked him, in a word, how would you describe the situation? He said, in a word, good. No, more than a word. He said, more than a word, not good. And in Lebanon, I mean, things are better than you would think, and things are much worse than you would think. And both are very important. What is functioning in Lebanon? And I say this because often when Lebanon is raised, or idea of helping Lebanon, a lot of people say, well, is there really a there there? Is there a state? Does it function? Can you lean on it, in that sense? And I definitely say yes in a big way. First of all, this is a country which has coexistence between Christians and Muslims while they're being beheaded just a few hours down the road. This is a country where there's coexistence between Sunnis and Shias, and they're massacring each other a few hours down the road. This is no mean achievement in today's Levant, and it has stayed and survived 4 years of sectarian and cross-religious and cross-sectarian butchery that's also aided and abetted by major regional powers. So this achievement, almost miraculous, I would say, really, because it's quite remarkable, is very, very historic, and it's extremely valuable to preserve. This is one of the only places in the Middle East where this is being achieved. Secondly, this is an inclusive democratic system. Like all democratic systems, from this one to others, it doesn't mean it's always greatly functional and always turns out with great results. But it is inclusive, and it is an electoral constitutional system. And this is one of the reasons it's remained stable. What we see today in Syria is really not about Sunnis and Shias and so on. It started with a regular demand by citizens for inclusion in constitutional government. 2 years later, turned into a shooting war. So the achievement, the political realities of Lebanon, with all their faults, are exceptional. This is a country with a strengthened army, which has played now a primary role over the last 3 years in protecting the Lebanese border. It has overshadowed Hezbollah as a fighting force protecting the country from Jabhat al-Nusra, ISIS, and others. Hezbollah dragged the country into the war. The army is defending the country from the war. The army has received a lot of support from the US and Saudi Arabia and others, and that is very important, but it has stood its ground and reinforced its position despite very delicate political situation inside the country and a very challenging situation on its borders. This is an army that has stood up. The internal security forces have also become extremely strengthened. The Minister of Interior this week is in DC. Met with him on Sunday. He's having official meetings throughout the week. The Ministry of Interior and the Internal Security Forces were not usually on the map in the US and elsewhere, but since the events of 2005 and then moving forward, the Internal Security Forces also are a serious intelligence organization, internal security organization, and have stood up as well. And Lebanon has always had excellent relations with the US and still does. So there's a lot that the country represents. There's a lot going for it. There's a functioning democratic inclusive system, state institutions, and so on. That's the better side of things. Things are much worse than they appear, and that, I think, is what the report does very, very well. In facts, figures, and numbers. This is the largest influx of refugees that I'm aware of in the world, in my recollection and my memory. It is certainly, as the report details, has overstretched government resources, overstretched municipal resources, overstretched the economy and the communities that are receiving these people. It's also changing the demographic balances of the country. As you know, this is a delicate, inclusive government that's built on certain agreements, which came with great difficulty. But the influx of 1.5 million Syrians, most of them from one community, not all, but most, the Sunni community, means that Lebanon is sort of turning into a Sunni majority country at a certain point. And that might have repercussions demographically and politically down the road. There are rising tensions with host communities. It is astounding that this country and these communities have been able to absorb the equivalent of 100 million people, that it's been absorbed for 4 years, no major breakdown, no major eruption. But these communities have paid a heavy price. In some cases, there's rising tension, both from municipal decisions taken to sort of curb the movement of Syrians, and some Syrians may be involved in acts of theft and criminality and so on. So it's a formula that has survived so far, but it's hard to see how it's going to survive too much longer. It's also a refugee population who doesn't appear to be able to go home anytime in the foreseeable future. There is no peace process in Syria, there is no ceasefire in Syria, there are no safe zones in Syria. So this 1.5 million is likely to stay for years and maybe forever, in the sense that these are also people who, not being from a very distant country, similar society, similar culture, easily able to stay in those sort of social, cultural terms. The real risk moving forward for Lebanon is something that has not happened yet, but is quite possible, which is organized radicalization and arming of even a fraction of this 1.5 million people. Half of these refugees are children. These are growing up without education, as was mentioned, in a very difficult situation, living through their families and the things they experienced in Syria, in conditions of polarization and civil war and so on. The risk of even a fraction of these young people becoming radicalized and carrying arms is real, and that is something that could easily overwhelm Lebanon as a country, and certainly Lebanon as a state. And that, to my mind, is the thing that could bring the whole house crashing down. As I said, the report really is excellent. One interesting point that the report makes, and that Jim mentioned, is that Lebanon is the anti-ISIS. I would also say Lebanon is the anti-sectarian civil war, it's anti-dictatorship. It's an example of what the future of the Levant might look like in a postmodern, post-conflict situation. At the end of the day, the Iraqis are going to have to sit down and work out an agreement among each other. They worked out a first agreement, work out, fighting through another. Sooner or later, it looks like later rather than sooner, the Syrians too are going to have to hammer out an agreement to coexist with each other, to share power with each other, and to live together and raise families in one country. Sadly, it took Lebanon 16 years of civil war to get there in 1990, but in a sense it did. While people are being beheaded, women are being enslaved, and all of that, just a few hours down the road, in Beirut you have free society, active civil society, pluralist communities, Christians and Muslims, as I said, Sunnis and Shias, in an inclusive democratic system despite its faults. So it's not only the anti-ISIS, it's also an example of how things could work with many problems and many dysfunctions in the Levant and possibly in other parts of the Middle East as well. So whereas Lebanon has often been discounted because it had a long civil war, because it doesn't have a majoritarian democratic system, that's not really understood in the US or France or UK, all of which have had their civil wars and then ended up with a majoritarian system. This is an inclusive system, which is different, and I don't think that's appreciated or understood enough in most Western countries. But it certainly is a very important example and model. As the report aptly demonstrates, the security threat is real. To my mind, the largest threat in the medium term is not. I mean, the threat from cross-border attacks and infiltrations from Jabhat al-Nusra or ISIS or others is big and real. But I think with the security forces and the society and support from the outside, that threat is being defended against, and I expect will continue to be. The higher threat is the one I mentioned, that unless these refugees, their needs and the needs of their communities are attended to much more urgently, and unless there's real attention to the danger of radicalization of some of the youth that are already in the country, if that happens, that is what will bring the whole country crashing down or into an uncontrollable civil war. What can be done? Again, the report very ably lays out sort of the menu, starting with the reality that the U.S. has been the biggest donor for the refugees, and the U.S. has been the longest sustained supporter, trainer, and partner of the Lebanese Armed Forces. The Minister of Interior is now in Washington trying to build up cooperation also between some of the U.S. sort of internal security and policing and intelligence, internal intelligence agencies and the Ministry of Interior, which would be a nice additional pillar in the U.S.-Lebanese relationship. So the U.S. is already doing a lot. The 4 avenues of action or policy, the first and obvious one is the aid itself. The U.S. being a big donor there, there's a donor conference happening at the end of this month, as was mentioned. But as Jim said, aid to the refugees is certainly important, but aid to the communities and the Lebanese themselves has to also keep pace. The level of poverty among Lebanese has almost doubled, the level of unemployment doubled, and tension between Lebanese and refugees in a situation where Lebanon and the Lebanese have been amazingly accommodating and generous to these refugees, but they shouldn't be made to pay the price. So the aid avenue is, clear, more aid, more engagement. Secondly, on security, the U.S. generally is well aware of that with the Lebanese army. The equipment, the training that the U.S. has given has been critical. People laughed a few years ago when the U.S. Offered one 12-seater Cessna propeller plane to the U.S. Air Force, whereas people, they're getting F-16s and so on. But that one Cessna propeller plane has made an enormous difference for the Lebanese army in the Kha Valley to be able to monitor what's going on in the Kalamout Plains. And that little bit of assistance has given the Lebanese army a great advantage. So every little bit helps. Artillery helps, surveillance equipment, more aircraft, which is being discussed with the U.S. and being offered, and also with an important arms deal with France, financed by Saudi Arabia. So cooperation with the Army, and as I said, with the Ministry of Interior. The Ministry of Interior is asking largely for sort of technical equipment that would be helpful in surveillance and in sort of intelligence operations. The ministry has already become, over the last decade, much more able to track people who are threats, external infiltration through phones and through other means of surveillance, and this has made and will continue to make an enormous difference. The Lebanese security forces preempted 2 major attacks over the last year. Suicide attacks that were caught before they did any damage. Some others were not caught, but there are results, and that must continue. So security is the second. Politics, I would say, it's an old relationship between the two countries. The Lebanese political system has survived without a price. There's no president. There's no legitimately sitting parliament, in the sense that this parliament has extended its own term twice. The country has not held parliamentary elections. And these have weakened the constitutional institutions. The U.S. doesn't necessarily control this agenda, but it should be important for U.S. diplomacy itself and with its friends in the region, and maybe seems to be talking more to Iran than to others, even with the Iranians, to put its shoulder to the wheel to help and encourage Lebanon and the many powers that are active there to move forward in electing a president. This office is not only critical to the normal functioning of the Lebanese government, passing legislation and forming a new government. There are a number of things that need the constitutional process to move forward. It's also part, as you know, of the communal deal that the presidency is a Christian position, whereas other main positions are for the other two, Sunni and Shia communities. So it's important, while Christians are being decimated in other parts of the Levant, to reinforce this position as well. And then the state needs to hold fresh elections. That presidency has to happen first. Finally, I'll end with regional policy. This problem originated because of events somewhere else, in Syria, obviously, and was the result of what happened in Syria, what outside players did or did not do, that took a protest movement from protests demanding reform in March 2011 to the biggest sectarian, biggest terrorist, biggest security threat to the region and perhaps the world since 2011. At the end of the day, these are refugees from Syria. They all want to go back to Syria in the whole. To be practical about it, I don't see in the near term any realistic possibility of a final settlement in Syria for many reasons. But I do think that there are realistic possibilities for creating safe zones in Syria, either through local ceasefires that are then reinforced by some UN presence and some guarantees, or through other mechanisms. These safe zones might be south, north. North is certainly the most amenable, I would say, to that, or the largest space which can be operated on in that sense. And I think this needs to be the proximate goal of the U.S. policy, as well as others in the region. With safe zones, many of these people could go back. I lived in Lebanon through the 15, 16 years of civil war. But most of the country throughout those 16 years was calm, was safe. I went to school, people went about their lives. There were parts of the country where you had to leave, but other places where people could thrive, raise children, have open schools, hospitals, and the rest of it. There's really no reason that as the crux of the Syrian conflict continues, and I don't see any end in sight currently, so it might go on for a decade and a half or two. In the meanwhile, there could be areas that are calmed down and made safe. And that should be a very, very high priority for everybody that's concerned about the Syrian crisis and for the U.S. as well. If that happens, then we could talk about at least the organized return of some of this 1.5 million people back to some areas of Syria, and that will begin to turn things in the right direction for Syria, but also in the right direction for them. Thank you.
Paul, thank you very much. That was very insightful. I want to recognize Congresswoman Gwen Graham, another one of our new Lebanese American members of Congress. She's a co-chair of the Lebanese American Caucus, along with, and a member along with Congressman Abraham. So thank you for being here. Jim, did you want to say something before we open it up?
No, I think Paul laid out the rest of the issues. Well, yes, I do. Let me just say this. Part of me wants to believe that that we can create a situation where people will return, and part of me knows that we will be here 3-4 years from now, and the situation will continue as it is in Lebanon. I have dealt with problems in the Middle East that have a way of lingering for long periods of time, while people continue to say, we have a short-term solution that will make it better, and it doesn't. And so there is emerging a new normal in Lebanon, and that is you got an additional 1.5 million people within the country. And the extent to which we don't address the urgent needs of Lebanon to have the capacity to absorb and deal with this problem while maintaining social stability, because we think that we're going to find a way to solve the problem next year or the year after and move people out, to that extent we won't be dealing with the urgent need that Lebanon has now to begin dealing with it. And if the problem continues to fester, if we don't deal with what we can do now to help Lebanon survive this crisis, there may not be a Lebanon to survive this crisis in the next couple of years. So I almost think that while I do believe you're right about the importance of considering safe zones, part of me thinks that that's not going to happen. And while it doesn't happen, and while we continue to talk about it maybe happening, the situation in Lebanon is becoming unsustainable. And so we ought not to delude ourselves that that we've got a short-term solution down the road, because Lebanon is facing an immediate crisis. 1.5 billion unemployed, people below the poverty line, unemployment doubling, 300,000 Lebanese kids now out of school because the country has made way for some Syrians to enter the school system. Still, far too many Syrian kids not in school, but even Lebanese kids are getting pushed out. And so the result is that you have everything there possible to create the kind of explosion that Paul warned about. And I'm worried that if we don't look at this problem now, which is why we did this report, to create a sense of urgency and a sense of importance about the need to find ways to deal with it quickly.
Well, I think Jim has refocused us on this issue of what can we do for Lebanon, what can we do for the communities in Lebanon. I think that that's a good focus. I happen to be one of the looters in Washington. I tend to always want to look optimistically that we're going to find public policy answers to things. And I continue to work on those things myself, and Paul and others, and Jim as well.
I worked with Vice President Gore during the 90s on the peace process, and issue that he charged us to deal with was to create jobs in the West Bank and Gaza. And in order to do that, we had to deal with two things. One is we had to find ways to get investment in. And two, we had to end the Israeli impediments to investment. Now, there were those on one side who said, oh no, if you're creating jobs, you're taking the pressure off, and that's not going to help the peace process move forward. On the other side, there were people who said, you know, if you bother the Israelis about the impediments to investment, you're going to create tension, and that's going to stop them from negotiating. And I said, pardon my French, bullshit. The fact is that if you don't put a chicken in every pot, if you don't give people a sense that life can get better, then you're going to have continued turmoil and tension. This problem's not going to get solved in the next 1, 2, 3, 4 years. And so the issue is you got to do something now. Guess what? I lost, and 20 years later, the Palestinian economy hasn't gotten better. People are still living under the... So that's where I get this urgency to, if you can do something to make life better now, there's no reason not to.
And I think we all agree on that. And I think that's a good stepping off point to have a discussion about Lebanon, the communities, and anything else you want to talk about. But that was the emphasis of what we wanted to present to you today. So my French is not as good as yours, but I think I understood most of your points, Jim. So do we have any people that want to lead off? Either one of the congressmen?
Two questions. Going forward in a couple of years, what do you anticipate the refugee population to be up from 1.5 to whatever that number is? And the second question, Ambassador, you said that only 52% of your donors have actually pointed up for the money and given it to you. Are the other 48% starting to put conditions on giving the money, or why aren't they pointing up from the pledges that they made?
Does somebody want to answer? Paul, do you know the answer to the first question?
I think the number's going to plateau.
At what number?
Probably where it is right now. You may get some additions, but Lebanon is putting some restrictions on people crossing. The international community is not happy that Lebanon is doing this, but frankly, they simply cannot continue to absorb what they were at one point was a couple thousand a day almost coming across that border. It's an impossible situation. So they've created some restrictions, and I think that you're going to have people going in the other direction, either to Turkey. Jordan, I think, is also having difficulties absorbing right now. Turkey can do a lot more, and then there's also increased pressure on not just here at home, but other countries to begin taking refugees out to sort of increase the, I think the White House has increased the limit, 70,000 up that we can take in overall, and of that, the portion going to the Middle East, Syrian and Iraqi, they've expanded that from 20-something to 33,000, and there's pressure now to, I know that our commission has asked to raise the limit to 100,000 and use a lot of that additional 30,000 for Syrian and Iraqi. And again, Europeans and Australians, others are also looking at taking some of these refugees out of Lebanon. So I think you're not going to see the number grow in the way that chart shows, or it's in the same chart as in the book.
It's getting pretty filled up.
Yeah, it's not going to go beyond where it is.
Yeah, just to confirm, I mean, the government took a very firm decision that is now was implemented from January of this year to now require conditions and visas for new Syrians coming in. So they're trying to cap the number. The refugees that are already registered, that's 1.2 million registered, and then there's others in the country for other reasons that are not registered. So probably not any major new influx. Some people might trickle back. There's a bit of controversy over this whole issue, obviously, because there are people who need refuge somewhere. Lebanon can't bear anymore. Also, the current conditions mean that if you're a refugee in Lebanon, the regulations also say that you cannot work, which is a problem for them to fend for themselves. It also says, largely, if you go back and visit in Syria, you're not going to be able to come back. So that might be a deterrent for people to go back and see how their village is doing. Can they, go back? So there's some problems there. It is remarkable that despite the U.S. aid, here's a country that, Lebanon, without any means, that accepted 1.6 million Syrians in general. The U.S., I don't think has actually accepted any more than a handful until now.
It's 1,000, I think.
Not even.
Over the past 4 years.
544
over the past 4 years.
544 individuals from the Syrian crisis. Lebanon has absorbed 30% of it. So there's no evenness in
the other question you raised, Dee, can you tell us some of the countries that have not fulfilled their pledge?
I think they've actually done a lot better.
Well, there's 48% out there.
That's the appeal, the UN appeal.
And who hasn't met those goals? Do you know?
You know, I took a look at the chart, and actually most countries that made pledges actually fulfilled them.
So where does the 48%?
The 48 is though the UNHCR made a certain appeal, and only 52% of that appeal has been made.
I see.
And
So
is not.
close, a larger percentage has, they delivered what they said they would, but of the appeal, 48% was.
Primarily the Saudis and the Kuwaitis.
And that's right, Saudis and Kuwaitis.
But
That answers the question.
yeah,
I wanted somebody else to
particularly
say it.
Kuwait
It is more diplomatic, but that's the answer.
Yeah, right.
That's the answer I was hoping somebody would say. So, but the appeal coming up is 8.4 billion, and we'll see what that produces. But something to watch closely as members. Other questions?
I mean, and just to that, every time we do meet with members of Congress, particular administration, we always urge that the United States put the squeeze on these countries that have not met their obligation to do that. That's one thing that I think members you can do when you're meeting with the diplomats or visitors coming from some of those countries to urge them to meet those. They made a pledge.
Right.
You're better off
Not making it,
and not fulfilling the pledge. And so,
that is very true.
yeah, I mean, if the pledge was not there, that's a different story. So when you have that opportunity, and I make this appeal again, please do that. Urge them to fulfill their pledges, the ones that haven't, and thank the ones, obviously, that are.
And again, the only concern about that I have is that it's important that they fulfill those pledges. It's important that they do what they can do for the refugees. But what is not being addressed is who's given money to help Lebanon build the capacity to absorb and to bear the shock of all this.
The good news.
And should there be a donor conference for Lebanon, maybe that's part of the issue.
Well, there's good news.
Yeah.
Those participating at the end of the month are actually coming with plans, as you know. The Interior Minister among them, with plans on that focuses totally on the community.
That's it.
So there's a new movement now, as Jim is highlighting, that we've got to really be concerned about the communities. Of course, there's this concern that they won't go back home. And we've got to address how you help the communities without, and also help the Lebanese government believe that these refugees do want to go home, and at the right time will go home. Questions? I have one question, maybe. We have one.
Hi, my name is Dina Elliott. I actually work with Syrian Refugees Development, and like Humanitarian aid internationally, there's been a lack of distribution of refugee absorption in general. Oxfam actually released a report at the end of last year that proved that Germany and Austria, I believe, were the only developed countries that actually met what would be considered their fair share of refugee absorption. So I'm just curious, is either Lebanon or the Lebanese government or any type of actor in Lebanon currently putting any type of pressure on the international community to absorb more refugees?
I don't know that answer, Paul or Jim.
Well, I mean, Lebanon can't put pressure on anybody, I guess, but it's always raised. I mean, Lebanese officials and others dealing with the Syrian crisis, it's obvious the burden has fell on Lebanon and Jordan, two very small countries, and Turkey, which can manage much better. It's not a secret that other countries are not opening their borders and are not taking their fair share, whether it's U.S. or Australia or others and so on. The Lebanese raise it, others raise it. They have no influence, unfortunately. It needs to be raised, I think, apparently here in the U.S. Congress, where also immigration is a sensitive issue. It's got to be seized as an important issue.
I think that you bring up a good point. that we have to really take with us to policymakers. It's a very good point, because there's a lot of forums coming up in the next few months where this should be discussed and at higher levels be thought about. So thank you. That was
So, Harry, do you have anything on that?
Yeah, not specifically on whether or not Lebanon is pressuring other countries. I think the international community as a whole is finally starting to think through how to deal with the refugee crisis. As we've heard, not more than 500 Syrians have been resettled in the United States. About 1,000 applications have been received by the United States from UNHCR, but it's a slow process because of various flaws in this country on security clearances. They need to be investigated and whatnot. It's a slow process, and I think the international community, including the two countries you mentioned, some of the Nordic countries, are also starting to move forward, but not fast enough.
There's an issue in this, issue of accepting refugees. Some countries, I've heard, have sort of proposed accepting Christians. A, because they're concerned about the Christians, and they're seen as maybe less of a security threat and so on. And this, a lot of Christians from Syria and Iraq and so on who are seeking some kind of refuge, but also a lot of church leaders and others who are warning that that should not be the policy. The policy should not be, let's empty the Middle East of Christians. Let's bring them all over here. It's a dangerous signal to send to the Christians of the region. But it is being, when some of the Western countries think about, bringing in people from Syria, they immediately think security. They say, well, we'll take Christians. They're not going to be members of ISIS or Al-Qaeda. But that raises a very serious long-term question about the survival of Christians in the Middle East. And it also makes people from the other camp say, yes, Christians are really Western, or they don't belong here, they should go to the West. But it's a very charged issue in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, Egypt.
And it's one that is playing out, you're right, I mean, it's playing out quite poorly. In ways that I find disturbing, both some of the advocates here who want to depopulate, and even some folks within the government who frankly have thrown their hands up in the air. And if we cannot create a situation where a Christian presence is a permanent feature of the Middle East, all of us will be the losers. All of us will be the losers. And so I think the point about Lebanon being the anti-ISIS, the one place where a kind of security exists for these diverse communities, despite the internal tensions, despite the difficulties that have existed. No community is threatened with extinction, or no community's survival is threatened in Lebanon. And so that is the model, I think, that we sort of devolved into. The idea at one point was, one man, one vote, pure democracy. But if the best we get is that the Lebanon model be applied elsewhere, that's not so bad right now. It's looking pretty good as a way for Syria and Iraq to model a notion that there's no victor, no vanquished. There is no one group that can dominate and destroy or evict the other. Lebanon has proven that model works, has a certain resilience to it.
And it's better than civil war.
Right. And that's exactly the lesson Lebanon.
Are there any other, George?
No, this is directed to Paul. Paul, could you address the issue of establishing camps or not establishing camps?
Yeah,
there's a big debate in the country on that issue. Dee and I last April of 2013 had an opportunity to visit, they call them settlements. In fact, they are camps. And they're just, one of the camps we went to, our host said to me, the first question, he said, welcome to hell. And when we were there, we understood it was clear what he meant. I think the minister now is in favor, I think, of supporting establishing camps. So is, what's his name, before. Could you address that issue, the advantages and disadvantages of having, because most of the people now are spread out, with the exception of the settlements. Could you address that issue,
And
please?
can you see it changing in terms of a Lebanese policy if this becomes a long-term situation?
Well, I mean, it's complicated in Lebanon, of course, because of the history of camps with the Palestinians,
Right.
which became then the key security thing, which was part of the lead-up to the Civil War. So there's always, after that, been a great sensitivity about camps. Then secondly, you know, when the refugees started streaming in, and because of the sensitivity to camps, unlike Jordan, also they didn't go for camps, and they received them in the communities, it initially worked very well. And UNRWA and others will tell you, UNHCR and so on, that as a model for receiving refugees globally, it's clear that receiving them in communities just works way better in terms of their welfare, at least in the short term. And Lebanon was sort of held up as a, you know, inadvertent model about how you absorb, you know, a million people in a country of 4 million. And still, the refugees are sort of okay, and the country survives. And initially, there were, you know, so about 3-4 years later, you now have the high cost that is being visible and becoming politicized in the communities. And these politicians represent people on the ground who, as the report indicates, poverty on the rise, unemployment, competition in the labor market, competition in the small business trade, and, you know, as, you know, in your first 6 months of being a refugee, you have some cash, you're okay, you're hoping to go home. By the 4th year, your savings are gone, you're desperate, you're out of school, crime is on the rise, you know, and hence, 4 years into it, we're now in a different situation. This is where I think the issue of camps has, you know, come back again. I'm not hugely concerned because you do now have a cap. So what you're talking about, certainly you're not going to be able to move, you know, 1.2 million from where they are in permanent camps. That's never going to happen. So I think what we might see is a few camps emerging to, you know, accommodate a small fraction of the Syrians that are already there. But the model is already established. There they are. You're not going to be able to move them, push them. It's sort of a done deal for now. But the pressure on the society, as the report indicates, that's the problem. Let alone if there's a refugee issue,
Yes,
in a camp issue.
Yeah, thank you. Jim, you mentioned, and this is obviously the case, that, you know, yeah, the international community is trying to deal with the Syrian refugees. The issue is how to help the Lebanese communities themselves. The reluctance, I believe, has always been that, not that we do not want to help the Lebanese communities dealing with this crisis, but the reluctance on the level of the international community is, okay, you send money to Lebanon, there is a problem in Lebanon, it's called Hezbollah, basically in control of the government, so to speak. So it's not necessarily looked at as a humanitarian issue, but as a political issue. What to do about the political system not working because some people are really in control of it not working. So how do you work around that?
Well, number one, I would differ with your assessment in that I don't ever think it gets that far. I mean, if I thought, for example, that there was this sensitivity here in Washington to the needs of Lebanon to address this problem, and that people were wringing their hands saying, but we can't do it because Hezbollah is there. They don't even, I think that Lebanon is the forgotten front. It's ignored in all of this. They took the refugees in, great, fine, they're not in Syria, we're now bombing Raqqa, you know, whatever, or wherever we're bombing. Number two, there are way too many international agencies operating in Lebanon, either under the auspices of the United Nations or groups like Save the Children and International Rescue Fund, etc., that are doing this work, who are vetted agencies that no one questions their ability to get this done, that are not having their appeals recognized right now by the United States, you know, as urgent and needed needs to be met. So I don't think there's an awareness, one, and two, if there were an awareness, there are plenty of places where the money can go that it doesn't have to go to something that Congress would feel uncomfortable with.
Well, let me also comment on that. I mean, The U.S. does work with the Lebanese army, even though there's questions about the army and Hezbollah working with the Ministry of Interior. So where there is a will, the issue of Hezbollah, although problematic, has not blocked. Another, I mean, part in terms of economic aid to the country itself, Lebanon, you know, it's not a lower income country, it's a middle income country. It was having a pretty strong growth trajectory. It has an enormous banking sector compared to its size. Now it's declining into a different situation. I think the thinking hasn't caught up. I mean, 4 or 5 years ago, you wouldn't think of economic aid or development aid to Lebanon as a big thing when you think of, you know, Egypt or Tunisia or Morocco, which have much greater needs. But we have now sort of, because of the refugee issue, sunk into a position where actually the country needs to be put back on sort of in the intensive care unit and requires attention. We're no longer on a growth spurt. We are now, you know, creaking under an enormous refugee, as well as, you know, we're surrounded by civil war. It's hard to attract tourist investment next door to Syria.
Sorry.
Yeah, this is a question on a kind of very basic logistical issue. Assuming the international community saw how much help Lebanon needed, what are the institutions and the mechanisms to make sure that money gets to Lebanese who are being priced out of the housing market, and then more schools being built, which are kind of the longer-term logistical issues to support so many?
In the back of the book, in the back of the report that we did, there are 2 reports by the United Nations that detail those very issues, what's needed and how to get what's needed to where it needs to go. Maria, do you want anything to add to that?
To what institutions, where the money
would go, and the plans that are there to.
I think that there's been, you know, some animosity about, you know, who needs aid and where is that aid money going. I think there need to be more direct investments. USAID has done a lot of direct investments in projects in, you know, municipalities and with communities based on resource, infrastructure, management of utilities, et cetera, and I believe education. I think that once there's at least some semblance of indirect, or not semblance because it exists, but, you know, more direct investment in Lebanese communities, they will feel confident in their ability to deal with the issues. I don't think that there's an unwillingness to want to deal with the problems there. I think as Paul referenced, the Lebanese were somewhat eager to, you know, accept this population in the beginning and manage it. I mean, there's always the issue of politics and corruption, and Lebanon's not free of those issues. So there's always a question of where is money going, who is money going to. You have a lot of, they have a lot of problems with, you know, resource, who controls resources, who gets electricity, who gets water, and different municipalities have different agendas on that part. So I think, you know, if politics can improve and you also see more direct management, or I mean direct investment in Lebanese communities, I think the situation will get better.
And one of the things you want to keep in mind is that Lebanon, USAID Lebanon's money is directed to refugee communities. It's not strictly for, I mean, not refugee communities, I'm sorry, Lebanese communities. And that's what our funding is used for. We've pivoted a number of programs towards that end. You know, we've got small and medium loans that we're making, and as you say, the municipal work that we're doing, wastewater treatment plants and things of that nature. And so, education, you know, working with rehabilitation of schools and things of that nature. So we're really looking at this thing as what we're doing for the Lebanese community in Lebanon. We got a lot of work with those guys as well.
I think that's a great summary to end this on. A lot has gone into it. America's made a great commitment, but there's so much more to do by focusing on these communities and joining together as civil society, governments, and the private sector. So thank you very much. Thank you, AAI. Thank you, Paul and MEI.